Hi, I'm Joel Addis, and it's nice to meet you. I'm looking forward to working with you as we work through this course. I'm currently a kindergarten through fifth grade special education teacher at El Paso Elementary in Derby, Kansas. I've done that for about 15 years. This year, I work with a team of 6 paras as we work to meet the needs of about 30 students on our caseload. Before I did that, I worked as a para in a classroom for students with intellectual disabilities, and that was actually my first job in the district. After that, I went back to school for my teaching degree, and during that time, I worked as a substitute teacher and a part-time custodian. I do some committee work as well in our district, and the thing that I'm most proudest of that is that I have been chairing our district's Special Education Advisory Committee for the last 10 years. This year, I'm also president of our local Teachers Association, DNEA, and that's been an experience that has really given me a lot of tools to help, visualize myself as a leader, just in terms of bringing people together who don't have necessarily the same view on something, but then working to find a common goal and a common path forward. And then also just communicating and collaborating with administrators and even our local board on a consistent basis. I teach at El Paso Elementary, and it is an early childhood through fifth grade attendance center. We have about 290 students in our building, and last year's data shows that we were 31 and 300% economically disadvantaged. 2 and 1900% of our students were English language learners, and 21 and 6/10% of our students had exceptionalities. We are part of Derby Public Schools. Last year, the school district had an enrollment of 7,416 students, spread across 9 elementary schools, 2 middle schools, and 1 high school. A little bit about my family. I've been married to my wife Angela for 16 years. She is a middle school band teacher. And we have 3 amazing kids. Our oldest son, Wilson, is in 5th grade. Our middle son, Henry, is in 2nd. And our youngest, Oscar, is in kindergarten. So now that I've told you a little bit about myself, I'd like to share my presentation with you about the 3 levels of government control in public education. So first, when I really looked at support for public schools at each level of government, that really led me to think of the funding for public schools at each level of government. And in the United States, public schools are funded through taxes. The majority of the money comes from state and local governments, with only about 8% coming from the federal government. And that money is earmarked towards providing students with equal access through Title I and other legislation. So because of that, close to 92% of funds actually come from state and local governments. On average, state governments furnish close to 50% funding for public education, and the remainder of that is generated by local governments by excising property taxes on homes and businesses within their boundaries. When we look at the authority in each level of government, first looking at the whole picture, and that is that in the United States, the responsibility to provide public education falls mostly on state and local governments, even though having a population that is educated for the times has been a strong national interest throughout our nation's history. The tension between these 2 viewpoints is reflected in the 10th and 14th Amendments to our Constitution. The 10th Amendment states that all powers not explicitly mentioned in the Constitution will go to state governments, including education. The 14th, however, shares that the government will step in if state governments are not providing equal access and equal protections to all citizens under their law. Regarding education, the 14th Amendment has been interpreted so that the federal government protects students' civil rights in public schools, and that began with the Supreme Court's ruling in 1954's Brown v. Board of Education case. So the federal government has no direct oversight over public schools, but the funding of public education by federal dollars is contingent on schools' compliance with federal law, beginning with the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, which was currently reauthorized as the Every Student Succeeds Act. In addition to those laws, federal laws related to education provides privacy for students' academic records and protections for students' civil rights by providing legal protection against discrimination based on sex, disability, race, and national origin. Federal laws also work to strengthen workforce development through the Workforce Innovation and Opportunities Act, as well as provide individuals with exceptionalities free, appropriate access to public education under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, as well as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So these laws created growing responsibilities, and that led to the creation of the United States Department of Education in 1979. And that way, those responsibilities could be administered from a central location. So while the Department of Ed does not have a direct oversight over public education, it does have an identified mission statement related to the education of students in public schools. And that mission is to promote student achievement and preparation for global competitiveness by fostering educational excellence and ensuring equal access. So there are two ways where the Department of Education carries out this mission. At the national level, the Secretary of Education and their department lead the dialogue on improving educational outcomes for all students. The department also administers the programs created by federal law that impacts K-12 education in our nation's public schools. Another government entity that has oversight over public education is the United States Equal Opportunity Commission. It's responsible for enforcing laws and regulations that make it illegal for employers to discriminate against current or potential employees due to sex, disability, race, and national origin. So these laws apply to employers with more than 15 employees, and that includes the majority of public schools in the United States. As I previously said, the founders delegated the responsibility of education to the states. Most state constitutions include language providing basic arrangements for public education. The state governments hold primary responsibility for public schools' accountability and oversight, allowing them to create the departments of education for their state, as well as enact legislation related to the education of students in public schools. State departments of education also create and implement content standards for reading, math, and other subjects, including social studies, sciences, and art. These standards serve as a general framework for each local district to determine what content to teach students, as well as providing guidelines for each district and state for evaluating how well schools are performing. And so then, the operation of public schools falls to local school boards. In the vast majority of school districts across the United States, these board members are elected by popular vote. They decide how education in the school district will operate, and they appoint a superintendent of schools who acts as the chief administrator for the school district. It's reflected in the board policies of many local school districts. I went to my own school districts, and their policies state right at the top that the governance of the district shall be vested in the board, and the board shall have the authority to conduct district business without specific statutory delegation. The board may transact all district business and adopt policies the board deems appropriate to perform its constitutional duty to maintain, develop, and operate local public schools. So this authority is critical because it helps manage the day-to-day operations of schools, decisions about curriculum, personnel, finance, and operations. So I really believe that the successful education of students in our schools is an effort that takes collaboration and input for all stakeholders. When we look at this through governmental support and oversight, that's reflected in the fact that the different roles all work together for the benefit of all students in public education. The federal level provides a small percentage of funding, as well as legislative protections and safeguards that allow for students with varying levels of need. So they provide a standardized measure of education across the country while still allowing for individualization at the student level. In turn, the states provide a larger portion of funding as well as state-specific content standards and laws related to the education in their public schools. So again, the state is providing a measure of standardized education across their state while still allowing the local school districts to individualize education in their community. Finally, each local community provides that final portion of funding while allowing their elected school board to determine the best way for the school districts to operate. The benefits of a strong public education system are felt at the local, state, and federal levels. As Harris stated, the national interest in having a well-educated populace is as strong as ever. So, then looking at each of our content standards, which level of government has the most influence over each one? For our first one, the local government has the most influence over this component. It's that local authority to manage the day-to-day operations of public schools in the community that touches on each of the specific tasks mentioned in this component. It's supported by the fact that so many of those tasks in this component are focused on the school level education of students. In terms of our second component, the state has the most influence over this component, given that the state is responsible for an average of close to 50% of school funding. The state's Department of Education also is responsible for developing state-specific standards, which are used to provide a framework where schools are evaluated for their effectiveness. And finally, on our last one, the federal government has the most influence over this component, primarily through the various legislative pieces it's enacted to impact all students' access to public schools. And I could read through the specific ones, but I think it's suffice to say that these laws work together to ensure that students have access to equal rights as learners in public schools. So when we're looking at the way this assignment correlated with the standards, it demonstrated correlation to the standard for this assignment by having students detail the supports and oversights for public education for each level of government, federal, state, and local. Once that information was gathered and reported, we were asked to evaluate which level of government had the most influence over each of the components of the overall standard. The relevancy, I thought that I was pretty well versed in school district finance given what I do in my current experience, but I found that there was a lot of knowledge I didn't have. It also really strengthened my knowledge of those different federal laws that impact the education of students in public schools. It also improved my knowledge of the three levels of government by presenting information on how they work together to provide educational oversight and authority. That concept of as the broader level providing what's needed while allowing the more centralized levels the freedom to individualize is one that I don't really know if I was able to articulate before I worked on this assignment. Reflecting, this assignment's going to change the way I teach and learn in a couple of ways. First, it provides me with a better understanding of how each level of government works to support the learning of students. That support is foundational to the work that educators do and will impact all those who work and learn in public schools. Second, this is my first assignment for this course of study, and I'm 11 years past when I got my master's. So while I've had experience writing, creating presentations, and presenting in the time since I was a student, this assignment stretched me more than I thought it would, just in terms of putting all the information together and also just with some of the technological changes of using the Screencast-O-Matic tool. This assignment will influence decisions I make as a future school leader by giving me a broader and deeper knowledge base about the educational funding provided by each level of government. And then that's going to give me a better understanding of school finance as I serve on different committees now, but then also work as an administrator in the future. And then also that increased knowledge about the authority afforded to each level of government will help me as I advocate for public education in my current role, as well as a future role as an administrator. And with that, that is the end of my presentation. Thank you for taking the time to review it.